Slime mold, time mold, welcome.
Hey, Spencer, thanks for having us.
Hi, Spencer. It's great to be here.
So you've done something very unusual, which is that you've created a whole new paradigm for psychology. And some people have really been taking note of it. Adam Mastriani said the following: "It's the most provocative thing I've read about psychology since I became a psychologist myself. This is probably the first time I've felt surprised by something in the field since 2016. So that's a lot of praise. So what I'd love to do with you today is explore your paradigm for psychology, also talk about some of its elements, talk about some of the ways I agree with it, point out maybe points of disagreement. I have my own ways of thinking about psychology. They're in some ways similar, some ways different. They're not formalized and written down yet, but I've been working on them for years. And so I think they'll be really interesting to explore."
Hell yeah.
Awesome. So let's start at the beginning. So a paradigm, you argue, is supposed to have entities and rules. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so a paradigm refers to a large variety of things, but we'd say something like a mature paradigm or like a scientific paradigm that's going to get you anywhere, that's going to lead to progress, has to be mechanical. But mechanical is a word that gets tossed around a lot, and I think it's better to be more specific. What does it really mean for something to be mechanical? And our basic argument is you need to have some idea of what the building blocks of your corner of the universe are, what are the entities involved, and then you need to have some kind of very specific proposal, or at least the start of a specific proposal, for how they interact. And those are the rules.
Right. So for physics, for example, what would the entities and rules be in some part of physics?
Yeah, well, like not being a physicist, we'd say things like, mass, charge, distance, and there's, specific rules about how those interact.
Right. So different formula about the way that charges affect each other across distance and that kind of thing. Those would be the rules.
Yeah, entities and rules is like a tiny bit of a slogan or catchphrase. If you unpack it a little bit, we'd probably say something like entities, properties, and rules. You need to have some kind of list, maybe not exhaustive, but you want the start of what kind of things exist in the universe or the part of the universe you care about, what properties they have, right? Because like particles have a mass and a charge, so those are more like properties. They're sort of distinct from the entities themselves, and then the rules about like how those interact, how they change over time.
And why does psychology need this?
Part of the problem with entities and rules is that it's we're still working on trying to figure out how to convey it, because there's like a sine qua non about it that is hard to put into language. Like it's like saying, when you're building a car, why do you need to know how the engine works? Like I'm really not sure how to answer that question. Like the engine works because it is the interaction of many smaller parts according to some kind of fixed rules. And if you don't believe that, I don't know how you can think that the engine works. So understanding it needs to involve some understanding of like what parts are under there and how do they relate. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Basically, you need to know very specifically what are we even talking about, and then what are the relationships between the things that we're talking about, that we're claiming, right? But some people might argue psychology as a field already has entities and rules, right? Like you look at like the big five model of personality. Well, conscientiousness, is that an entity? Or IQ, is that an entity? And then there would be rules around this, like people who are conscientious, well, they're going to be more orderly. If you go check their rooms, you're going to find they're more organized than people who don't have high conscientiousness.
Yes, to us those seem like they're abstractions. And again, this is one of those things that we're still working on how to put it into language. But those are abstractions in part because, you make a judgment about whether or not someone's conscientious based on their external behavior. It's like saying that a car is fast, right? Or that a house is big. Cars are fast and houses are big as a consequence of the little moving parts inside them, right? The systems that give rise to these situations or behaviors. And it's fine to be like, this car is fast, that car is slow. This car makes good gas mileage, this car is terrible. But they are that way for a reason. And while abstractions can be useful and maybe even profound, they're not mechanical understandings of these issues. So like whatever makes people extroverted or introverted or conscientious is something inside of their mind, maybe inside of their brain, depending on how you think it's best to analyze it. But you can't get very far appealing to abstractions alone.
So would you argue that most of the concepts in psychology that are used today are actually abstractions? They're not entities and rules?
Absolutely. In fact, I'd say I would challenge anyone to say anything that's mechanical in psychology today. Like, I'm not closed-minded about it, but if there's a concept in psychology that people think is mechanical, I'd love to hear what it is.
Let me give you some background on this project too, because really we started writing about cybernetics after we wrote a book about obesity, where we basically started thinking about human behavior in terms of thermostats and set points, and basically we couldn't stop. It's a really kind of addicting idea, and we started seeing it so many different places. And so The Mind and the Wheel, which is our newest book that is available on simultimewell.com, is really just exploring those ideas much further and asking a bunch of questions.
Right. So your paradigm is a cybernetic paradigm for psychology. And you're saying that through your obesity research, you started using a cybernetic paradigm, and then you started saying, oh, wait, this is a really powerful idea that has much broader applicability than obesity. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
That's very well said.
Maybe just briefly, we're not going to focus on the obesity research here, but maybe just briefly, do you want to talk about the obesity research and kind of how this came into play?
Sure. So it was the pandemic, and we were like, we should collaborate on stuff. And we started a lot of different projects, and some of them went nowhere, but one of them went somewhere pretty interesting, we think. It was taking a look at the obesity epidemic in terms of a couple of, like a pair of perspectives, one of them, one unusual and one not so unusual. The not so unusual one is the idea that weight regulation is homeostatic, right? That it's cybernetic. This is something that lay people don't usually buy into, but this is the dominant perspective in the research community, right?
Can you unpack that? Because I don't know if people know what that means.
Sure. The idea is that, and obviously in reality it's much more complicated than this, but the idea is that your body has a set point, a weight that it wants to be at, and it defends it vigorously in both directions. If you eat a lot or you do things to gain weight, the body will take action like making you raise your body temperature, making you fidget, driving you to eat less to bring your weight down. If you weigh less than you need to, then your body will do things like make you use less energy and make you try to eat more to try to defend it in that direction. And in this perspective, what happens in obesity is that for some reason, an unknown reason, the set point is raised. So while your body's natural set point might be 180 pounds, if you were to take, reach a hand into the brain and turn that thermostat to 300 pounds, suddenly you're going to gain a lot of weight and it's going to be really tightly defended.
If you look at shows like The Biggest Loser, where they would have people compete to lose weight, a remarkable finding is that years later, after people had lost tons of weight in the show, many of them regained the weight or most of it. And so that kind of suggests, maybe there's a set point kind of thing going on here, that the body's kind of defending a set point.
Yeah, and the set point is defended in the opposite direction too, right? When they do overfeeding studies, where they have people intentionally eat 10,000 calories a day, people do gain weight temporarily, but they lose it very quickly, going back almost to right where they started. And so that and a bunch of other evidence has convinced the research community that for the most part, weight gain and obesity seems to be the result of a change in your set point. And so we combined that relatively orthodox perspective with a slightly unusual one, although we weren't the first to suggest it, which is that the obesity epidemic might be caused by some kind of contaminant in the environment. So this has been proposed before, but it hasn't been investigated. We thought there was still more to find out, and so we looked into it. And then the only really original thing that we contributed was we looked into lithium in particular. We think that there's a good chance that lithium might be the contaminant, or at least there's evidence to suggest that lithium might be the contaminant behind the obesity epidemic. That lithium, or possibly some other contaminant or contaminants, are the factor that is changing people's set points so that they defend a higher weight than normal.
Yeah, for anyone interested in that in particular, you can go read a long series of articles about that they've written. They're very interesting. I wasn't persuaded, but maybe we can talk about that in another episode, but I do think it's very interesting, and I think you make a lot of interesting points there. But okay. So then, just to clarify further, the word cybernetic, what is that referring to here?
Yeah, so cybernetics is the interdisciplinary field, or at least it was conceived as an interdisciplinary field, studying negative feedback or control.
Right, so it's basically this idea that the body or the mind wants things to be at a particular level, and then if they're deviating from that level, the body is going to kind of detect an error signal and then try to get back to that level. Is that right?
No, much more. I mean, that's correct, but it's much broader than that. So the earliest work in cybernetics, although it wasn't called that yet, was in mechanical control systems. So I think Christian Huygens worked on controlling the speed of windmills, and I can't remember his name, but centrifugal governors or in general, mechanical governors were essential to the development of steam engines, right? If you have a steam engine, you want it to be hot, but not so hot that it explodes. And this is actually a pretty tricky balance to strike. And so they used mechanical governors to regulate the temperature of their engines, making it so that they could keep their steam engines running without blowing up, right? If you're running a boiler, you have to be pretty careful about it. And so the earliest work in this was actually mechanical, and there was some early mathematical work in it by James Clerk Maxwell. And then Norbert Wiener and Arturo Rosenblatt ended up sort of pulling this together. I think Wiener used it in some of his, I think it was anti-aircraft gun designs, and they were like, it seems like there's a bunch of principles here which sort of exist across fields. There's definitely some control problems in engineering, but also there are control problems in biology, and there are control problems in psychology. So let's make an interdisciplinary field that covers all of them so we can sort of compare notes and see if anything comes of it.
So from this broader field of cybernetics, what are you bringing into your cybernetic theory of psychology?
Yeah, so in some ways I think it's deceptively simple, but I think that's often how science works, right? It doesn't seem like rocket science for Sir Isaac Newton to say, I think that the laws of motion on Earth and in the heavens might be the same laws. Like, that's not really like a galaxy brain moment. It's just a change in perspective, but it's a change in perspective that's really important. And so similarly, it's not like there's like some very particular technical observations that we're bringing into psychology. We're just saying, what if you start thinking about things in terms of negative feedback? What if you start asking things, because that suggests very specific questions. As soon as you start saying, what parts of this are any parts of this negative feedback, you start saying things like, well, what's the rate of feedback? What's the set point? What is being controlled? And we think that those questions are really generative.
And just for the listener, could you explain the difference between negative feedback and positive feedback?
Sure. So in negative feedback, you have a number, an error signal, which the system attempts to send towards zero. So it's a bunch of different parts that act together to take some number and try to send it to zero. In positive feedback, you have some number or value, you could say, and it compounds upon itself instead. So it gets bigger and bigger, and it goes towards infinity, or as large as it can within the limits of the system.
Right. So then you want to say that a number of elements of the human mind have a kind of negative feedback style, which is distinct from claiming there'd be a positive feedback. And there's also a lot of other claims that could be made that are neither positive nor negative. Is that right?
That's right. It's not that like psychology normally has been built around positive feedback and we think negative feedback is better. It's, although you can say there's sort of it's more that psychology hasn't really been recently examined in these terms or thoroughly examined in these terms. And we think that there's a bunch of low-hanging fruit that you can pluck as soon as you start asking these questions.
I think staying grounded in the metaphor of a thermostat is really useful for thinking about cybernetics. So like we just talked through the weight set point, but you can also be like, okay, I have a thermostat in my body for like salt, and I have another one for sleep, and I have another one for social things also, like maybe the number of people looking at me, and I get both upset if more people or less people look at me because I'm trying to like hit my set point.
Yeah, another way to answer your question, Spencer, might be by going back to entities and rules, right? So if psychology is, as we argued, like largely abstract, and you need some kind of like specific mechanical proposal to bring it into being a mature science, then definitely one of the benefits of cybernetics is we can say, here's an actual mechanical system, even in the sense of like you can literally have machines that do simple versions of these tasks. And we're going to bring these in as a proposal for the kinds of entities and rules that are going on behind the scenes when you see something like someone cleaning up their room or not cleaning up their room, right? When we have these abstractions like conscientiousness, we can say, is it possible to build a mechanical theory using these mechanical parts? And while it's not the only proposal that you can have for the entities and rules behind the human mind or behind minds in general, it is one of the very small number of proposals we're aware of that seem like they could be functional at all.
One of the most interesting things about working on this project is that responses generally fall into two categories. People are basically like, yes, cybernetics, I've already heard of it, what's new? And then the other half of people are like, I've never heard about this before, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's a funny kind of thing where sometimes when someone proposes something new, people can't agree whether it's like obvious and trivial or
old and
absolutely
boring.
wrong and crazy. Yeah, yeah, or yeah, exactly. So it can be very polarizing. And we just to clarify, when you say mechanical, do you mean you could literally write down like a series of rules that it follows, or do you mean something else by mechanical?
So I think that there are different degrees of mechanical, and this is part of why we use the phrase entities and rules more than we say mechanical, although there's reasons to use both. I think at the most basic level, mechanical is just looking at surface level behavior and trying to say what parts underneath are causing that behavior. So instead of just being like, this car is fast, this person is conscientious, you say what parts of their mind are giving rise to this conscientiousness, right? Why are some people conscientious and not others? What's creating this behavior? And then more specifically, you can try to have particular proposals for entities and rules. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Although one thing it makes me wonder about is like, it seems like you've got to bottom out somewhere, right? At the bottom, you have to have something that doesn't have a causal explanation, right?
Yeah, so great point. But I think that this is true in every science, right? You can bottom out physics at some point and be like, these are the rules as low as we've found them. And you can be like, great, what caused the rules? And they have to shrug their shoulders and say, who knows? I think that's just like irreducible. You can always push it down to another level of what's happening under the hood here. And obviously everyone's going to push it as far as they can. But making it mechanical at all is what leads to the benefits of having a mature science.
To me, the idea of a paradigm is about pointing to what the most interesting questions are. So I think that one of the reasons cybernetics is so compelling is because it highlights how understanding drives can help us explain human behavior.
Yeah, and there's another point here, which is, I think you're right about the right to ask, like, is this going to give us the ability to like actually write out a series of rules that are testable? Or you said something along those lines. And I think the answer is eventually. Like, this is part of the reason that we start by talking about the history of chemistry. Like, the early days of chemistry, they actually were not able to do, they were not able to describe quantifiable rules. They eventually got there by starting by talking about mechanical theories of chemistry. Like, they started coming up with ideas about what was going on beneath the surface. And eventually, if you pursue that far enough, you do get the ability to write down very specific rules. And we don't claim that we can do that yet. We just think that this is the first step on the path towards being able to do that. So it's like aspirationally, yes, you can sit down and write down the rules, but that requires a lot more research.
Got it. So what are some of the entities?
The entities are governors, they're control systems, and we can say some things about the parts, right? In a basic sort of stereotypical governor, you have an input function, which creates a percept, a type of signal measuring the thing you care about in the world. Maybe I should explain it in terms of a thermostat.
For anybody who is listening, I would really recommend going and looking at part 1 of The Mind and the Wheel, because I definitely think that the visual aids are very helpful if you are not familiar with cybernetics.
Yeah, and we'll link to that in the show notes.
Fantastic. So yeah, stereotypical world's most simple thermostat. Obviously, in reality, you can make much more complicated control systems. Obviously, like the human mind at least, is biological, so it's going to be complicated in all these additional ways. But starting with like the stereotypical basic thing, a thermostat cares about the temperature of your house. So your house is some temperature. The thermostat has an input function, some kind of mechanical device that detects the temperature of your house, and it turns it into a signal. That signal is sometimes called the percept. So it's an estimate, a measure of the temperature of your house. Separately, a human being has set the set point, which is the desired temperature of your house, let's say 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Then there's a component called the comparator, which is really simple. It just compares the percept to the set point. So it says, is the house the temperature that I want it to be? And if not, what's the difference? So the comparator compares those two numbers and it creates a new signal, which is the error signal. It's literally just the difference between the set point and the percept. So if the house is too warm, it'll be above, and if it's too cold, it'll be below. And then the error signal is passed to an output function, which can be very simple. Like, it can just be like, if there is an error, if the house is too cold, you turn on the furnace. Output functions can also be very complicated. Obviously, in humans, like for us to do something like control our social status, or even just like control our blood sugar, the output function is really complicated. We have to do a lot of stuff to accomplish those goals. But it passes it to an output function which takes some kind of action on the world. And if the thermostat is built well, then the output function will do something that will close the loop. So it will reduce the error signal towards 0, and it will hopefully keep it there.
Okay, so let's apply that now to a specific human governor that you hypothesize.
Sure. I mean, we can go back to our obesity research, right? So again, we think it's more complicated than this in reality. But there's assuming that there's a set point for weight. If your weight is set to 300 pounds, obviously it wouldn't be in those units, and there's a system that exists for regulating your body weight, then it's going to defend that. So if you go on a crash diet, it will do things like it will make you really sluggish, right? The output function will take actions to, we think of it in terms of like the output function will vote against you doing things like going for a run. It will vote against you doing things like getting up off the couch, right? If you reduce your calorie intake, it will take steps to reduce your calorie output too. It will do things to defend your body weight. Or conversely, if you're lower weight and you overeat, your output function will vote for things like fidgeting. It will vote for things like, jumping around your room, going for a run, going out to see people.
But people might think, oh, okay, so you're kind of talking about these sort of very biological things. They may have trouble connecting it to human psychology. So what's an example that really is fundamentally psychological in nature, where you can still see this idea of a governor?
Eating is psychological.
Yeah, we see this as fundamentally psychological. And this is just like, it's hard to know how to make this case because like eating is a behavior. Where do you decide to eat from? Like, where do you feel hunger? This is all in the mind. It's not like it's somewhere else. You need to use your brain to be like, am I hungry? Okay, let's make a sandwich. Like that doesn't happen separately.
Yeah, and I agree with that. On the other hand, it's sort of a lot easier, I think, for people to immediately see it for hunger, that it works that way, than, let's say, an emotion.
That's why we use that as an example to ground the rest of the paradigm in.
Yeah, we think hunger is an emotion. And obviously, like, this is at some level semantic, but...
Yes, plenty of people don't like us calling that, like, using the word emotion. So, if you feel more comfortable thinking about it as a feeling, that's fine, but hunger is absolutely a feeling.
Right. So let's do another feeling that maybe seems more psychological in nature. Even though I agree with you, hunger, there's obviously a strong psychological component there. But I don't know what a good example would be. Fear.
Fear seems like a great example, and I think we can. Here's an example. Have you ever fed sparrows in the park?
Like feeding them breadcrumbs?
Breadcrumbs, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So unless they've been fed a lot, you see sort of a counterplay between two of these drives. Obviously, like the sparrows are hungry, they want to eat the bread, but they're also afraid of you, and they don't know what you're going to do. So if you scatter the breadcrumbs too close to your feet, you'll see a bunch of these sparrows reach an equilibrium. They will come and they'll approach you, but they will hold off at a certain distance before eventually approaching slower and slower until they grab the breadcrumbs one at a time. And obviously you can interpret this however you want, but we interpret this as a tension between at least two governors. One governor that's saying you should walk forward, get the food, you're hungry, eat it, and another governor for fear, which is saying don't approach the big, strange, scary animal that's huge and could kill you, might be hunting you. And these reach an equilibrium, which for a while leads to inaction or hesitation.
And what's the case that fear actually works on a governor system, where you got these, a signal, a set point, a comparator, an error signal, and an output function, rather than being modeled by something else?
What's the alternative? I guess maybe we'd say something like, and this is one of the difficulties when talking about paradigms at all, because at some level of perspective is a matter of faith, at least until it's been supported, right? Like even things like conservation of mass. The early chemists were like, we're going to start by assuming that mass is conserved, and this ends up being a really useful assumption, even if you eventually do end up in some places where it's no longer true. Or for example, they were saying we're going to consider things to be an element if they can't be divided, if they don't have any smaller pieces. And this ended up being a really useful perspective, even though it ended up actually not being true, right? When they discovered isotopes, that was a big shock to the system. But thinking about things in terms of elements continued to be useful even after the definition of element really fundamentally changed.
Do people of different genders actually have different personalities? We've all heard that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, but we've also heard that men and women are actually no different from each other at their core. Clearly, both of these perspectives can't be right. Is one of them accurate, or are they both just sensationalized nonsense? To try to answer these questions, the team at clearerthinking.org analyzed enormous amounts of data, ran 15 separate studies, and have now published their results in the form of a free, data-driven test called the Gender Continuum Test. You can take this fun test to learn about the relationship between gender and personality based on data from more than 15,000 people. And you'll probably learn some things about yourself in the process too, since it'll provide a personalized analysis of your personality. To take the Gender Continuum test, or to find Clearer Thinking's other free tools and mini-courses, visit clearerthinking.org.
So in your paradigm, you want to say that things like fear have a governor, right? And so they work through negative feedback. What does this actually imply about fear rather than sort of a much less detailed model of fear? Like someone might just say, oh yeah, we have this thing fear. When there's something dangerous, we feel fear and we try to, avoid the thing that we're afraid of, right? But you have a more precise model. You're saying, no, fear is actually controlled by a governor system, right? A negative feedback loop. So what is that? What are you actually claiming about fear that sort of a simple model wouldn't claim about fear?
That's great. Well, I think at first we want to say it's good to have a model at all, right? And I don't think that there's any competing mechanical model for fear out there. It's not that I'm aware of. People are just discussing it abstractly. So saying here's a potential mechanical model is good at all. But you're right, there are more specific claims. So there are claims like everyone's going to have a set point. That means there's going to be a point, and it may not be like a strict threshold, but there's going to be some kind of point past which fear is the error signal in this case. So there's going to be a point of danger past which you see behavioral changes start to kick in.
Fear actually corresponds to the error signal when there's a gap between the set point and what's actually measured. Is that right? That's how you think about fear?
That's right. So you should see things like in principle at least, it would be possible to discover what the set point is. You'd be able to show that different people have different set points, or that maybe being in different situations, being exposed to different substances changes your set point or reduces the error signal. It also suggests that the error signal might eventually be quantifiable. I guess it suggests other things which are not necessarily linked to it being a governor per se, but it suggests things that fear is meaningfully distinct from the other values being controlled, and it will compete with other motivations and trade off against them.
So with obesity, we could think about the set point as being a set point in body weight or something like that, or body mass percentage. For fear, what is the thing that is being set? Is it the danger level?
Yeah, so we'd say there's some kind of perceptive danger, and obviously the question of how that's generated is a good and open-ended one, and it's probably very complicated. And that's compared to some set point for danger. When danger is above the set point, then, or possibly below, you never know how these things are actually wired up. When it is past the set point, then you start generating an error of fear, and as fear gets bigger, it exerts a larger and larger influence over your behavior.
So then would this assume that some people actually have an amount of danger that's above zero that they're sort of trying to get to in some way? If they're at zero danger, that they're actually is some part of them that's trying to increase danger levels?
Yeah, great question. We think so, although we also think that this would likely be a different governor. So there are neurological reasons, and I think phenomenological reasons, to suspect that when you have different governors controlling the lower and the upper, when you have control on both the lower and the upper bound of a signal biologically, these would be different governors. So we think, for example, there's one governor, at least one governor, keeping you from getting too hot, and a separate governor keeping you from getting too cold. And so, fear makes it clear that we have a governor keeping us from getting in too much danger. There may actually be a governor that encourages us to go out and get into a certain level of danger. But that's an open research question, right? Is there actually be in danger governor? It certainly seems like there might be. People definitely have behavior where they go out and put themselves in danger. But that might be coming from a different source of motivation. If you can get status by showing that you're not afraid of danger, maybe some kind of status governor is voting for that instead.
So it could be the case that the set point of danger for everyone is zero, and all they're trying to do is kind of get down to the zero level, or it could be that there's individual differences where some people it's set at zero, but some people it's above zero, and they're there's some more danger seekers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so fear is going to be a governor that's trying to keep danger below some level. Probably not zero, since we don't seem to be afraid when we're just walking down the street, even though we're in some danger, although obviously we don't really know how the mind constructs its perceptive danger. And in that, I think basically, there's some people with knockouts. Basically, everyone tries to keep their danger level below some amount.
I see. So it could be some small amount that you're below that amount, you just don't feel any danger, right? The danger of walking down the street normally. There's always some danger you get killed by a car or bike or something, but most people don't feel afraid because it's small enough danger level.
Yeah, I mean, similarly to there's a thermostat and it's trying to keep your house, above or no lower than 72 degrees. It's not generating an error signal when your house is at 80 degrees because it's above that level. Or like a steam boiler, it's got a governor that's trying to keep it below, I don't know, 1,000 psi. I have no idea if that's a reasonable number. 1,000 units. And when it's below 1,000 units, it's just like totally inactive. And so similarly, when you're below 1,000 units of danger, your fear governor might be like, I don't care. And then when it gets above 1,000, you're like, okay, we're generating an error signal. That error signal is perceived as fear. We're going to start trying to exert some kind of influence on behavior to try to make us in less danger. And there might be, like you suggest, a separate system trying to keep you above some level of danger. But if so, we think there'd be a different governor.
Now, my understanding is you want to apply this to many, many aspects of human psychology, right? So we talked about fear, we talked about hunger, but how many are we talking about? Are we talking about hundreds of these potentially?
Yeah, potentially. I think it's a lot like the search for the elements, right? You start out with 4 and you're like, well, maybe there are more. How many more? Turns out more than 100. And it definitely seems like people have dozens of different sources of motivation. We've got dozens of different things we need to do to keep ourselves alive. And maybe there are hundreds, perhaps thousands. Like, we think that probably the mind, or our intuition is that the mind is ultimately going to be reducible to a finite number of motivations, but it's also possible that that number is really, really large. But the fact that we have like a few sort of keystone things, like don't get too cold, don't get too hot, make sure you drink water, don't let a lion eat you, suggests that there is in fact like a relatively finite list, but who knows?
And you mentioned in your writing that even hunger might actually have many different governors. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so this seems like one of the strongest cases for the idea that there might be hundreds and hundreds of different governors. So it's easy to think about hunger as one drive, but it's pretty clear that it's not when you look at it more closely. So for example, if we give you a salt, well, what's the best example? Have you ever had the dessert stomach effect where you eat a big meal and you say, I'm so full, but then somebody says, do you want this chocolate lava cake? And you say, absolutely, I would love some. This suggests that even though a bunch of your hunger governors are exhausted or fully satisfied, you still have other drives for other things. So maybe a better way of saying this is like, look, if you put out a salt lick, deer and moose from the local woods will come out and lick the salt. And it's clear that this means that they must have a desire for salt. They have some kind of psychological drive for it because they're not getting anything else out of licking the salt lick. And so for humans, it seems like we definitely have a drive for like, if you have an empty frying pan in front of you, you will add butter, but you don't just eat the butter, even though it's a source of calories. Then you add, some bread, or you add some salt, you add some chicken, right? And so it seems like there are a bunch of different, at least a couple different hunger drives, and maybe dozens and dozens, because, if you're pregnant, you'll get all kinds of weird cravings. Or if you're a vegetarian, you will, get deficient in certain things.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's scientifically debated to what extent people actually have cravings for things they need, right? Like, let's say you're low in vitamin C. Will you crave citrus fruit because it has vitamin C? And I think there's actually a lack of consensus on this right now, or at least a lack of consensus on how far it goes. Like, I think everyone kind of agrees that there's a general hunger drive we have, but not everyone agrees it could get to the specificity of the level of a single vitamin.
Yeah, it's a great question. But again, like once you start, we're kind of surprised that there hasn't been more work in this direction, but maybe it's just because once you frame it in this way, it does start seeming like a really fundamental psychological question. And we also think that you can come up with methods to investigate these things. Like it is possible to design studies where you can answer questions like, does an animal deficient in vitamin C actively seek it out? Or can it not tell the difference between like water fortified with vitamin C and water without? And so you can start getting like very objective or like very clear answers to very basic psychological questions. Maybe it's because it's normally seen as nutrition, but we don't see, we think that these are basic psychological questions.
Now, fear to me seems easier to fit in your model, but what about something like anger? Like, how does that actually fit in? What is the thing that's being set with the set point?
Yeah, great question. So I think the thing that makes this easier to interpret is remembering that, at least in our model, all of the emotions are error signals. So in this case, you have to say what aspect of your life is out of alignment, not under control when you're angry. And I would say that this is something like social control. So when you are not in, and I know this is a little awkward because control obviously is a technical term here, but when you're not in control of a situation, then you tend to get angry.
So you're saying that sort of social control is the thing that you want to have at least a certain amount of it. When you get below that, then you get this error signal. The error signal is like anger itself, and then your body takes action to kind of get you back into social control.
Exactly, right? And it's definitely possible that anger does seem like it's one of the less immediately applicable. Anger seems like it is one of the worst fits in terms of this model. But again,
that's why I chose it, because I wanted to see what you'd say.
No, yeah. But actually, like, that seems really productive to us, right? The fact that it's a bad fit for this suggests that it must be something else. And so then you start saying, wow, unlike all these hungers, and unlike fear, and unlike maybe social status, and unlike feeling hot and feeling cold, anger seems kind of weird. Is anger a different kind of thing psychologically? This is not the kind of question that people normally ask in psychology. So this is why it seems really generative. Can we look at anger and be like, yeah, actually, it does make sense to see this as a error signal like these other ones. It's homeostatic. There's some kind of anger governor. Or is anger like really a different class of signals that operates on different rules? It's a fascinating question. And I would definitely, I think we would continue to sort of err on the side of ultimately it can be understood as an error signal coming from a governor, just because we think that that's sort of the strongest null hypothesis for any of these emotions. But it might not be.
That's one of the things I really like about your paradigm, because there's aspects of it that I agree with and aspects I disagree. But what is really nice is like you're making crisp claims that then we can actually talk about, okay, well, is anger fit this model? And if not, like there should be an experiment that can be conducted to like kind of refute that it works this way, right?
Exactly. And to circle back to entities and rules, like this is the reason that mechanical science is necessary. And this is why you have to get all the way down, or as far down as you can, into the entities and rules if you want to get those benefits, because it forces you to maybe not make specific claims, because like we're not married to any of these things, but it forces you to construct specific claims, which means you get specific questions which are super generative. And it means that you suggest all kinds of questions, like the question you're asking about anger, whether you intend to or not. And so it's just like tossing us all these like really productive research directions, and only questions like, what do we go after first? Like what's easiest, what's most tractable, what's most interesting?
This might be a good moment to talk about like a way that I disagree with you, which is that I actually think your model works really well for things like hunger and keeping the body temperature regulated. I think it's like very, very much like a thermostat. I think my own view is that we're typically called emotions, so not emotions in your theory, but things like anger and fear and sadness and things like that. I think of them quite a bit differently as not trying to keep some kind of set point, but rather I think of them more like your ears and your eyes, the way that through evolutionary history, eyes evolved, ears evolved, and each of them evolved to like solve a sets of problems, right? Like, with eyes, you can kind of see food and then it makes it easier to find, or you can see predators and it makes it easier to get away. And ears, solve an overlapping set of problems, but they're different, right? And eyes and ears are different, but they're both like hyper-specific in a way, right? Like eyes are there to, perceive light, and ears are there to perceive sound, right? And I think of the emotions as being like that they're these very specific evolved mechanisms that are trying to detect particular settings. And then when this kind of setting is detected, you experience the emotion, and that at that moment, there's a bunch of behaviors that kind of change. And the stronger you feel the emotion, the more it like pushes those behaviors into that different mode. And the reason it does that is because pushing the behaviors into that different mode in that kind of setting gives you a survival advantage. And so, for example, the way that I think about anger is that it typically occurs when you feel like there's a particular agent that is threatening things that you value. And when your brain detects that kind of setting, you start to feel angry. And as it ramps up more and more, there's a sort of predictable set of anger behaviors that start getting activated. The more you feel angry, the more those behaviors get activated. When you're extremely angry, then there's a very stereotypical set of behaviors that people engage in when they're angry. Like they start shouting, they clench their fists, they're much more prone to like start physically fighting or threatening, etc. So that's how I think about it, which I think is a bit different. So I'm curious to hear your comments on the way I look at it versus the way you look at it.
Yeah, so that doesn't seem totally incompatible, right? There's no reason that what did you call it? The thing that's being measured.
So I think of it as like there's some kind of part of your mind, not necessarily like a physically distinct part of your brain, but it's part of your mind that's kind of scanning the world for this type of situation. And in this case, for anger, the way I would describe that type of situation it's monitoring for is there's an agent that's threatening things you value. And then when that's detected, it starts like you start getting this anger signal, and then that anger signal comes with it a characteristic set of behaviors.
I mean, I think that can definitely fit with a lot of my understanding of cybernetics. It stands out to me how much you're using the word setting, and you were talking about different modes, which I think resonates with me. And it sounds like maybe you're proposing that for the anger thermostat, it's like a feeling of other people having more power than you is like what that is controlling for.
I would say threatening things you value, which is slightly different, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that matches quite nicely with lived experience in terms of like the thing that I see people get the most angry about is definitely politics, which I think really does speak to that power differential and feeling like other people have control over things that you value.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an open question whether it is sort of constructed in a negative feedback sense. But I don't think that there's any reason that it's necessarily in conflict, right? You can have a governor that's detecting something, we don't need to pin it down exactly, comparing it to an acceptable level of that thing, outputting a signal which we interpret as anger, or we experience as anger, which drives certain behaviors. I think maybe one of the things that I hear, or at least the way you describe it, I don't know if this is something that you feel strongly about, is the idea that all of these behaviors are innate rather than learned. But I would expect that like even anger responses are like highly socially determined. Like people from different cultures, even different subcultures, will express anger in very different ways, even if it like always ultimately leads to physical violence.
Yeah. So if I try to kind of put a point on like, in what way do I actually disagree with you? In what way does what I said not fit into your model? I think that the key thing is that I don't think there's a negative feedback loop, which I think is key to your model. If it's not key to your model, then I'm not sure what is key to your model. So would you say that is really essential?
Why do you think that it doesn't have a negative feedback loop? Like when you are angry, you take actions, and those actions make you less angry, right?
No, I don't think that's. I think they can often make you more angry. Actually, like I think a standard thing that happens in anger is that you take actions that actually make the other person angry, and then you both keep making each other more and more angry, and eventually you get in a physical altercation. Like that's like I think of that as a very characteristic of anger.
Although, like, eventually anger goes to zero, right?
Oh, sure. But that's like, I think typically because you're no longer detecting that there's like a threat to your values occurring from an agent that's like you can interact with.
Well, but that's what I mean, right? You detect that there's no longer a threat. This is just like anything else being homeostatic, right? You detect that the temperature is now in line with, it's now above or below the threshold.
Well, I think a key thing here is how would you program an agent, right? Like imagine you're making a computer program for like a little simulated world, like Adam Mastriani brings this up in his blog post about your work of like programming the Sims. And it's funny because I use that exact kind of way of thinking when I'm thinking about psychology a lot of like, okay, you're programming a little sim creature, right, to behave as much as possible like a human. How do you actually write the code? And I think if I understand your paradigm, the way you write the code is that there's a thing that's being measured, there's a set point for it, there's an error signal, and then it tries to get back to the set point, right? And the way that I would write the code, the way I describe this for anger, is more like there's a sensor. It's a sensor for a very abstract quantity, like there's an agent that's trying to threaten the things you value that you can interact with. And then basically that there's like sort of as that a signal ramps up, like there's a specific sort of behavioral vector that affects your normal behavior pattern vector and change. So now, and then like the stronger it is, the more that behavior vector changes the current vector. So I think the code is actually different.
Oh yeah, that doesn't sound different at all to me, or at least it certainly could be implemented as a control system.
Yeah, I don't see anything in there that feels contradictory to me.
If you think about the idea of like modeling the motion of the planets, right? So back in the day, people didn't know the right way to model the motion of the planets, and some people said, oh, maybe they're circular orbits, but that didn't fit the data very well. But then people figured out, okay, but if you make a circular orbit within a circular orbit, you can model it better, and you can do that if you keep repeating that, a circular orbit within a circular orbit within a circular orbit, it gets even better. And people sometimes make fun of this idea as like, oh, that's so ridiculous. But actually, it was an incredibly cool idea because it was actually sort of the basis of what we now call Fourier analysis, which it turns out there's this very powerful and flexible way to model a signal. You can model pretty much any periodic signal, a repeating signal, using sort of sine waves within sine waves within sine waves. So it's a very actually powerful concept. Now, The problem with it was so powerful that it turned out it ended up just sort of mathematically modeling things, not getting at the underlying reality very well. And once you switch to elliptical orbits, you could see, that's actually much like, Occam's razor, much simpler model for everything. You don't need like circles within circles within circles. But that doesn't mean that repeated circles idea was a bad idea. It just was a very flexible and powerful idea, almost like too flexible and too powerful to actually see the underlying reality. So I guess that makes me wonder is like this idea of, cybernetics, is it so powerful that it could kind of model anything? And if it can, then is it really making any claims, right? If you can, since I don't think I would program, thinking about cybernetics, I don't think I would program that sim to have anger in the same way I would based on my model. But then you're saying, well, maybe there is a cybernetic model that gets exactly the same output as what I'm describing.
So this sort of gets to maybe a crux of the questions around like, where is psychology going and what do you need? A lot of people, when they hear about this idea, come back at us and say, this is interesting. I'm pretty convinced, or at least I'm intrigued. So what prediction does the theory make that we can go out and test? And so I feel like your question is coming from a very similar position. And that's not how we think about it. Like, we think that it's true that that theories do eventually get to the point where they're very robust and you can make like called shots, you can make a prediction that doesn't line up with anything that's seen before. But that's not what they look like in the beginning. In the beginning, a really good paradigm asks really interesting questions. It's really generative. And it asks questions in a way that lets you like substantially disagree and go after empirical questions with a real sense of direction. And so we feel like that's what it offers. Like it's I think there is a sense in which like the epicycles, you can always construct a way to sort of explain things in terms of control, probably, let's say for the sake of argument. But I think that's actually just true of any paradigm. Like, you can divide up the entities of the universe in any way you want. And the question is like, is it useful? And like, does it have like a good ratio of simplicity to usefulness? Right? And since we're relatively early on that path, we don't know for sure, but it's very exciting to start seeing things these ways because it leads us to these questions that seem super generative. So whether or not it ends up being the case that thinking about things in terms of governor is the place that we'll end up, it seems like a great place to start because we have these kinds of conversations. Like, do people have different set points for anger? If it's cybernetic, if it's a governor, then they have to. Or they, for some reason, all have the same set point. But like, what's the set point for anger is a reasonable question. Whereas if you're right, maybe that's not a reasonable question and you'd see something else.
Okay, so imagine I put forward a theory or a paradigm for human psychology. And I said, it turns out my theory is that humans are Turing machines. And now all we need to do is figure out what code that we're running in our minds, right? And I think, and for those listening who don't know what that means, a Turing machine, basically it's a model of computation. And sort of anything that can be computed with a computer can fit into a Turing machine model. And I would say that's not a very good paradigm because it can kind of capture anything, but also it just doesn't tell you very much, right? Just it's sort of like, okay, yes, there are some people that think human behavior can't be modeled as a Turing machine. There is a group that say that. So it's not claiming literally nothing, but it's such a general and powerful paradigm that it's like making very, very little claim. And now like you still have like almost all the work to do, which is to describe, okay, but what are the computations the mind is doing, right?
Totally agree. I think that's bad for two reasons. First of all, it's bad because, as you say, it's fully general. It can't really be disproven because this, as far as we know, is just like a feature of all computation. But I think it's also bad because it doesn't suggest any research directions. Even if you're like, yeah, absolutely, then you're like, so what? Whereas cybernetics, at least as we've applied it, we feel like does immediately suggest a lot of different research directions because you have to ask things like, how many governors are there? What are they controlling? What are their set points? And you can start asking questions about like, what are their output functions? Do different people have different gains on their output functions? And so maybe we'll end up in a place. So we would not be at all disappointed if 100 years from now people had really rigorously pursued this perspective and found out that actually like nothing in the mind is cybernetic, because it's not really a paradigm about how things will turn out. It's a paradigm about how to investigate these questions.
Okay, so could your paradigm be disproven, or do you think that that's not the sort of thing one does to a paradigm?
Yeah, paradigms can't be disproven because you can choose to divide up the universe however you want. It's just that some ways of dividing up the universe end up being sort of useful and tractable and others don't.
So it's more a claim about essentially like a way of looking at things that you think will be a fruitful direction for the field, rather than a claim about the human mind fundamentally.
Precisely. And it certainly could be the case that this ends up being correct in some sense about the human mind fundamentally, but it's much more that it seems like it's a fruitful direction.
Yet, unlike a Turing machine, there are some things that can't be modeled cybernetically. And so if like a lot of the human behavior or action did not fit a cybernetic model, wouldn't that suggest it was not the paradigm wasn't a very good one?
It's a good one if it gets us to a mature science of psychology.
Okay, so it practically might help even if it's then most human behavior can't be modeled that way, you're saying?
Yeah, compared to most approaches to psychology that are available right now, this one is at least somewhat mechanical, and it seems like it's really suggestive. So if somebody has a better, more mechanical paradigm, if they have, or even just an alternate one, we think that'd be worth pursuing too. But it's hard to not look at the juicy questions suggested by this direction and be like, that's a good direction to try.
One thing I really like about your paradigm is that it does immediately suggest some things that are a priori surprising, right? Like, for example, that happiness is not an emotion according to the theory, which I think most people would say, wait, isn't it an emotion?
Yeah, and to sort of make the case for the idea that the social emotions are in fact also negative feedback loops, I'd say something like this. Like, evolution is pretty parsimonious. If it's got a piece that's working, I don't see why it wouldn't just like continue to apply that elsewhere. So you got really simple organisms that evolved to control things like the salt level and the sugar level of their blood and like how much danger they're in. Really basic stuff like that. Control their body temperature. And they have a brain that helps them do all these things. When it comes time for them to exist in like a social network, or when it comes time for them to do other more complicated things, they already have this pretty sophisticated motivational system which trades off between a bunch of different negative feedback loops. Why would evolution bother to evolve this whole new set of things when it could just be like, I'm going to adapt a new control system, add another governor to control this other signal? And obviously it might not do that, but it seems like a good starting assumption to be like, yeah, we have these governors, let's just like keep copying that code to support this new need.
Right, but I suppose if it turned out, for example, that positive feedback loops are really useful for modeling some things, that would be one reason why it might deviate from that.
Yeah, potentially.
Let's go into happiness a little more. Could you explain how it fits into your paradigm?
Yeah, so happiness doesn't seem like the other subjective experiences. It doesn't seem like it's an emotion because happiness, successful behavior doesn't drive it to zero, right? You're not trying to reduce your happiness, whereas behavior is always trying to reduce your feelings of cold, your feelings of being too hot, your feelings of hunger, your feelings of shame. And so happiness seems like it's probably a different kind of signal because doesn't seem like it follows the same rules.
So how does it fit into your model exactly? What is it in your model?
Yeah, so we suspect that happiness is a different kind of signal and that it probably is related to regulating explore versus exploit. This is a basic sort of trade-off in machine learning. If you have a number of good options, but you can also go out and look for other ones, do you explore and try to find new options that are better than your current lineup, or do you exploit the best of your current set of options? So like if you've moved to a new city and you've gone to just like 2 or 3 restaurants, do you want to go out and explore the other 500 restaurants in the city, or do you want to go to the best restaurant you found so far? And so in general, one of the things that happiness might be used for is it might be used to calibrate this. We think that, to back up a little, we think that happiness is generated through, it's something of a function of when the other errors are corrected. So if you're really hungry and you eat a sandwich, that makes you happy. Or if you're really lonely and you see friends all of a sudden, that makes you really happy too. And so this is how we think that it can helps calibrate explore versus exploit.
So essentially all of these other governors we're talking about could produce happiness as you correct the errors in them.
That's right. And it's probably not as simple as like correct 1 unit of error, get 1 unit of happiness. Because, for example, like eating a sandwich that you've had a lot, even though it's really good, it doesn't seem like that makes people super happy. So it may have something to do with like what the difference between the expected correction and the actual correction, right? If you expect a large correction from something, it may not make you very happy. Sort of a hedonic treadmill situation. But we think that this might calibrate explore versus exploit, because in general, if your happiness is high, that means that you're correcting a lot of errors. You're very successfully navigating your environment. Whereas if your happiness is low, it means that your strategies are not really working and maybe you should try new strategies. So that's one proposal. It's also possible that happiness's main role is in learning. So this is a signal that we experience sort of as a side effect of when like a new strategy is being stored. So if you do something that is good and you didn't know about it already, it makes you happy, and the happiness is sort of the signal that carries it to your memory, or it's affiliated with the signal that carries it to your memory.
Do you have an idea for a digital product that could improve the world? Are you frustrated by cookie-cutter survey platforms that don't give you the level of personalization you need for your research content? GuidedTrack might be what you're looking for. GuidedTrack will empower you to effortlessly create and launch apps, surveys, educational modules, prototypes, and online tools, even if you have no programming experience. From Ayla's famous Kink survey to the quiz called Can You Guess Which Studies Replicate, made by 80,000 Hours, GuidedTrack's easy-to-use platform and flexible interface has enabled some of the most creative people and organizations to bring their impactful ideas to life. In fact, it's what we've used to build all 70 of Clearer Thinking's interactive digital tools. To make it even easier for you to embark on your next project, we've recently launched 10 free templates. Simply choose the template that aligns best with your goals and customize the content as needed. But you want to know what the best part is? GuidedTrack is completely free to use. So visit guidedtrack.com to sign up for your free account and start making your next big thing.
I find this really interesting because something I've long wondered about is whether there really are multiple positive emotions. As far as I know, every single theory of emotions that's out there says that there are multiple negative emotions. For example, that anger and sadness are like importantly distinct.
Yeah, everyone agrees these are different.
But it's really unclear on the positive side. Like, you know, if you think about positive emotions, like feeling relaxed, feeling happy, feeling awe is, you know, generally considered a positive emotion. It's like much less clear that we're talking about actually different emotions. Like clearly something like relaxed is also talking about the absence of certain negative emotions, like feeling, you know, stressed, for example, or anxious. But it's not clear whether it's talking about a distinct positive emotion. And it sort of seems like not. And so I think that's interesting that in your theory, you've got like a clean way of explaining why there might only be one. Although I suppose your approach doesn't guarantee that there's only one, because maybe different types of errors being reduced could produce different sorts of happiness signals. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely start from a place of being like, we've looked at it, and at least with the model that we've proposed, there's only one positive emotion. And in fact, we think it isn't an emotion because it's a whole different class of things. There's one positive signal. And it's possible that that's wrong. It's definitely possible that there are other things, like awe might be more of a one-off, like anger. They're their own class of things. But yeah, our intuition lines up with yours.
One thing we haven't discussed yet is how the governors work together, right? Suppose there are many of them, maybe hundreds of them. How does that lead to actual human behavior?
Yeah, so you only have one body, and it means that your governors have to sort of share the road. They've got to come to a compromise about what kinds of behaviors are going to be carried out and the order that they're going to be carried out in. And so we think that there's some kind of parliamentary procedure, which we don't fully understand yet, where governors submit bids or votes for certain actions or plans of action. And the strength of these bids is some kind of function of the size of the error signal. So if you're really, really tired, then like the bid to go to sleep or at least lie down is going to get more votes, and so you're more likely to do that. If you're in a lot of pain or if you're in a lot of danger, you're going to get a lot of votes for the things that will help you rectify, the behaviors that you think will help you rectify that situation. It's probably not just a function of the error signal, because there are obviously some error signals like suffocation that demand really high priority, and so it's possible that there are sort of different functions for each governor based on things like the size of their error signal, but there may be other elements as well.
And then we also expect that different people will have different set points. So one of the like most fun things to think about from this paradigm, in my opinion, is just being like, people can be in the same situation materially, but based on their set points, it might behave quite differently.
That's right. And so they might have both like different set points, and they'll have like different strengths. They'll get more votes for the same amount of error signal, or possibly they'll have like a faster or more like powerful connection between a governor and the sort of voting mechanism, leading that governor to have more or less influence over the votes. The exact parameters are something we still don't really know about, but we would expect that this is a major source of individual differences.
Right. So this could explain things like personality, like how different people have different personalities.
Yeah, my whole
Exactly.
personality is wanting salt.
Yeah, for real. We actually have it's clear that we have something different about our salt governors. We both really, really like salty foods and will eat pure salt off a plate. Most people don't do that. And
You can catch me pouring salt on the back of my hand and then licking it off.
Yeah. And so which parameter is this? Do we have an unusually high set point, or do we have some other, is there some other parameter that's set unusually? Not clear yet, but we think that's evidence of an unusual setting. And again, this is once you sort of sit down and try to build a model of it, you would have to actually define at least a proposal for those parameters, and then you could go out and try to test them.
Right. So would you suggest that if you were trying to construct a model of personality using your paradigm, you'd think about each of the parameters of these governors? So for each person, you could think about, well, what's their set point for governor one? What's the person's set point? What's the sensitivity of the set point? And so on. And then if you go through all the different governors and then you map out all the different parameters, the sum total of all those things would be a person's personality, essentially.
Exactly right. So every governor has, K parameters. At least one of those is going to be the set point. We don't really know how many there are. And then there's also going to be a set of parameters about how the governors interact with the voting mechanism, and maybe there are also parameters of the voting mechanism. And together, these form at least a large part of personality. And obviously, this is very different from current theories of personality because it's really, really highly dimensional. Not just there are 5 different personality categories. There are many, many different ways, precise ways in which your personality can differ.
And do you have a theory of why, for example, when people are asked to describe themselves and then you take all the words they use and then you do a factor analysis, you get kind of these 5 signals a lot of the time or most of the time of conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, openness, neuroticism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess we can say 2 things about that. First of all, it's not totally clear to us what the null hypothesis is. So is a 5-factor solution sort of just the default for doing a large factor analysis on this kind of data set? Right? It could just be that if you had some sort of randomly generated corpus, you would tend to get 5 factors out of it anyways. And so this says nothing about the human mind and maybe something more about very, very large data sets.
My experiences know that you could get 3, you could get 1, you could get 7. But it's an interesting point. Were you going to make another point about that?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that we would interpret it more sort of linguistically and socially. So it seems like there are 5 dimensions that currently that we tend to care to talk about in language, right? Because we have all of these words in modern society about things like conscientiousness, because it's one of the things that we care to talk about. It's important to us. We don't have a ton of adjectives for things like, do you have a very strong salt or sugar drive? Although we can talk about it, right? There are phrases like sweet tooth, but we don't have a whole panoply of adjectives for it, because even though people differ in this way, it's not culturally relevant. In contrast, if you went back to medieval Iceland, they had a ton of different words for being brave or being cowardly, because it was really important to their culture. It's something that they wanted to talk about a bunch. So you'd probably find a different set of factors if you analyzed, Icelandic adjectives corresponding to however many dimensions they care to talk about the most. So it's not necessarily a good read on personality per se, but rather the types of differences in people that are relevant to talk about.
Yeah, there's some debate whether you get different models of personality if you run analyses on different cultures, right? So a lot of in sort of what they call weird cultures like America, you tend to get the big 5, I think most people agree. Or sometimes people will say you get 6, actually, the big 6. But then, maybe if you go to Papua New Guinea and maybe you don't get the same thing.
Yeah, although I guess I would sort of sidestep the question and say the real problem with the big 5 and every other theory of personality is that it's abstract, right? It is at some level really genuinely not a scientific theory. Abstractions are fine, they can be useful, but it's not making any kind of appeal to the mechanisms that are happening underneath. So it's at best a superficial theory of personality.
Yeah, it's kind of an observation, an empirical observation in a way, more than a theory, right? It's we do this and we find this result.
Exactly. It's fine if you're a naturalist to be there are cows and there are sheep, and they seem like different kinds of things, but it's very, very different from doing biology, and it's really, really different from trying to even before we knew what DNA was, trying to say like, okay, why are sheep different from cows? Like, what is the fundamental actual thing going on that makes one of them grow this way and the other one grow that way?
I would say that IQ is a lot like this too. It's an empirical observation, essentially, that if you give people a whole wide range of intelligence tasks, that there tends to be correlation between them, and you can do this operation to compute this number, and then that number predicts different things. There's way more consensus on that observation or series of observations than on like, well, what is that thing, IQ? And like, which is actually still debatable and often debated.
Exactly, and this is why we challenged you at the start by saying, is there anything from psychology that's mechanical? There are many things in psychology that are useful. There are many things that are robust and reliable. Like, there's definitely been some problems, but there are things in psychology that are really robust. And yet, I don't think there's any part of psychology, or very, very few parts, that are mechanical. They're all basically, like you said, observations. They're all abstract. They're all superficial.
I guess I'm not exactly clear still what it would take to make it mechanical, right? Like let's take the theory of ego depletion, which I don't really believe the theory of ego depletion, just to be clear. But let's suppose, but it's a theory. It's out there, and I think it says, okay, there's some quantity of the mind that gets depleted as you exert willpower. It's sort of like a battery of some sort, and as you exert willpower, it goes down, and then if you later encounter things that require willpower, like you'll be less successful at doing those. Like, if you're given a plate of cookies and radishes, you'll tend to choose the cookies more because you'll have less willpower left. And then there were even more specific claims, like giving people glucose can then like increase the battery more quickly so that then later they can use willpower more effectively later on. So what about that is not mechanical?
Yeah, great. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. It's not like literally 100% superficial. I think what's missing is entities and rules, and this is why we tend to use that phrasing slightly more than mechanical. It's okay to say that there's something like a willpower gauge under the hood, but it's a pretty, and I mean, like I said, it's better than sort of the general state of the art in that you're at least postulating about something. But it's, I think the main thing that's missing here is that it's not sort of trying to provide a set of building blocks for the mind in general, right? So there's one proposal for one value. There is a willpower value, and you can say things like, when you eat more sugar, it goes up. When you eat less sugar, it goes down, or it's related to calorie expenditure. But it's not sort of a proposal for the class of things that exist inside the mind. You're not being like, it's a specific proposal rather than a proposal for a class of entities, right? Like when chemistry, yeah, like it's like I said, there's a sense in which it is like much better than not proposing anything at all. Like it's better than the big five because the big five make no reference to sort of the inner workings at all. Putting your neck out and being like, we think that there's a scalar value for willpower and it sort of has these rules attached to it is good. But chemistry starts by being like, let's try to assume that everything is particles with like mass and velocity, and we're going to sort of bootstrap from there, even though that ends up being like not entirely correct. You want to have as comprehensive a proposal for like classes of entities that will appear over and over again and the rules that govern them.
I go back to like thinking about programming sims and being like, okay, imagine you're programming them. You could quite easily imagine trying to program ego depletion into your sim, right? It's like just a single number, and it kind of, as they expend glucose, it goes down, and then they don't resist the cookies or whatever. With the big five, you could also try imagining, you've got these 5 numbers you're going to put in your sim, and it's going to, how often it like organizes its room will depend on the conscientiousness number. But it does feel a little bit different to me because the 5 numbers of the big 5 personality model do seem much more abstract to me. And it like for example, an issue with them is that they seem to mix like beliefs with behaviors with like patterns and things like that. And like sort of like a lot of different kinds of entities kind of get combined together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, maybe this is, like we said, we're still sort of figuring out the best ways to talk about this. Maybe a good way to think about it is it generative or exception based? So like, both the big 5 and ego depletion, ego depletion appeals to entities, to some kind of thing under the hood, but it's like definitely more of an exception-based system. You were going to add this entity on top to try to appeal to this, to try to appeal to an explanation of this particular situation. Whereas we think of real entities and rules paradigm is you say, these are the entities that we think are going to populate the world, and then we're going to sort of keep extending it out and try to explain as many phenomena as we can in terms of these tools. Does that seem like it resonates?
Yeah, I think it's trying to do a different thing because like ego depletion is just trying to explain one little aspect of the world by like creating a new entity just for that thing in the world rather than provide a paradigm for what's going on generally.
Yeah, or maybe something to pick on even more is like grit. You can be like, some people can go through this hard situation, others people can't. Why? Because their grit number is different. At some level, this is not superficial because you're at least pushing it down to like a lower level. But I think on another level, like it's absolutely not, it's not very specific, right? You can be like, grit goes up when you go do hard, or goes down when you do hard things and goes up when you do easy things or something. But you're really just like adding a noun in between. It doesn't really have any specificity about its like properties or the rules that govern its interaction. And it's maybe even still superficial. I don't know, it's still quite hard to, quite difficult to think about. We're working on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that you brought up glucose as part of this ego depletion study, and yet I feel like you have a hard time seeing hunger as an emotion.
I would draw the distinction between emotion as the way people typically use the word, right? And I don't think the way people typically use the word, people consider hunger an emotion.
Sure.
But I do think it's, hunger is clearly highly psychological, right? I think it's got to be the case. Like, I don't know what else it could be other than psychological, although it feels very physical. And so I think it's easy to like lose sight of the psychological aspect, where something like fear kind of like, it's really clear it's psychological. Like hunger, you might feel like it's more rooted in the body rather than the mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just interesting to try to really bring to the conscious mind that type of bias that I think a lot of people have when they approach this idea.
Mm-hmm. Going back to grit for a second, I think we can start to see a challenge that the field of psychology has with the way that it defines things, because there's a debate of, is grit the same as conscientiousness, right? So you have conscientiousness from the Big Five model, and then you have this newer construct, grit, which is trying to explain people like sticking with things like, do they succeed at, difficult training in the military, right? Or do they give up? Things like that. And sort of like grit is proposed as this kind of more specific thing. But we actually did a survey of academic psychologists, and we asked them about this very question, like, what is grit in relation to conscientiousness? Because they're known to be correlated. Like the empirical observations, there's a strong correlation between them. And we found that about 50% of people who had an opinion, they said that grit is actually just identical to conscientiousness. It's just like a renaming. And then 50% said it is not identical. People, I think like getting really precise with what the heck we're talking about is actually really difficult in psychology and can create lots of problems. Like, you have half the field saying this is not a new entity and half the field being like, no, it is a new entity, right?
Yeah, it's hard to know even where to start with that. You're like, the responses to this set of questions on this questionnaire are correlated with the responses to this set of questions in this other questionnaire. Like, what are we doing? Like, what's going on here? Those questions fundamentally don't seem scientific to me. And it is quite hard to say why that is not scientific and other things are, but it really seems like you're barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, so let's talk about this with regard to the replication crisis in psychology, where lots of major findings have not replicated when people redo the studies from scratch. How do you see sort of your ideas about paradigm like relating to things like the replication crisis?
Sure. So we think that the replication crisis is definitely bad, but not really for the reasons that people normally think. Like the replication crisis deals with issues of statistics and methods, right? Are you doing the right analyses? And are you designing your studies in sort of the correct way or in a way that will yield meaningful results? And we think that the focus on this is on some level good. Like it's definitely bad to p-hack your data. It's definitely bad to design studies in a way that leads to ambiguous results. Like you want your methods and your stats to be good, but also these are like not important things to work on if the questions that you're asking are fundamentally meaningless. So if you're purely asking about abstractions, or if you're just shuffling around different nouns, then like it doesn't actually matter if your methods and your stats are really good. You're not sort of going anywhere. So it's not really clear that it's not like people were really focused on questions of meaning, and then the replication crisis swept in and pushed them towards thinking about methods and stats. But there is this sort of substitution effect where when people dedicate their time and energy to trying to make psychology better. They tend to think about it for the last decade. They've tended to think about it in terms of like, can we do our stats right? Can we not fabricate? Can we design our studies well? And those are the wrong questions to ask, because it doesn't matter how good your stats and methods are if you're asking the wrong kinds of questions. Like, you need to be a mature science, which means we need a paradigm. And so all of the effort towards making psychology better should be about asking better questions. Because while you do need good methods and stats, good analyses to yield progress, like, those only are useful if they're asking reasonable questions.
So it's the idea that without a paradigm, quote unquote, wrong questions are being asked. And so, well, yes, to make progress, you would need to do good statistics. Like, it doesn't really matter if you're asking the wrong questions, because it's not going to get you anywhere anyway. And so we need a paradigm that like sets us up to ask sort of sensible questions that can enable progress.
Exactly right. Back when they were in the paradigm of the four humors, doctors might argue about like the best way to try to figure out how much phlegm somebody had. Just like, it doesn't matter how good your methods are, it's the wrong questions. Back before modern chemistry, you might be like, did the world start out as all water or all fire? Again, like, doesn't matter how good your methods or your stats are, it's just like the wrong question to ask. And so when you're in a not mature science, you should really be focusing on questions of meaningfulness. I mean, not exclusively, right? Like, it's also bad for other reasons that people are out there fabricating so much data. There's so much outright fraud. But you're never going to rescue psychology into a mature science purely through methods and stats. It's just like not the right direction.
It seems to me a paradigm is really useful. Not all paradigms are equal. How would you think about what makes a paradigm better than another paradigm?
Co-author, you got any thoughts on this?
A good paradigm is one that you can't get out of your head.
Well, you mentioned earlier also that a good paradigm brings questions to the forefront, like, so it's generative in that way. Would you add that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we ended up writing this whole book basically because we started thinking about things in terms of cybernetics, and we're just like, wow, actually, this is kind of great, and leads me to ask all of these interesting and new questions and have new and exciting thoughts. And so that's why we really wanted to write it up and share it publicly and have these kinds of conversations with people, because we think that this is what science is really about, is having the discussions about the questions and then going and trying to figure out what's actually going on here.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. So a paradigm, we think, so there have been like attempts at paradigms in psychology before. So like cognitive psychology is one of them. We think that these are not really paradigms, but proto-paradigms, because they don't have entities and rules, right? They're not fully mechanical. Behaviorism was a little bit better in that it was specific in some ways, but ultimately that was more of a proto-paradigm too. So for something to be an actual paradigm, it needs to be specific enough, and it really needs to have a proposal, even if only at a sort of starter level, about the entities and rules that make up that corner of the universe. I mean, the other way it's usually presented is that a paradigm leads you to an era of puzzle solving. And so it's there can be different opinions about how to put that into words, but I would say like a paradigm identifies specific openings that seem like they can be filled, but they're tractable with the tools available. So like chemistry did this with the question of the elements, right? Once they started discovering new gaseous elements, they realized there might be a lot of different elements. And they said, well, we can at least prospectively discover the elements by trying to divide substances. Anything that we can divide can't be an element, because elements can't be divided. Anything we can't divide might be an element. And so you started getting these questions of, for any given substance, is it an element or not? What are the elements? Is light an element, or is it some other kind of thing? And so you can see that like when chemistry started moving into its mature phase, there were a bunch of these specifically open questions. And then like once the periodic law was discovered, there were literally gaps. Like the periodic table for a while was literally a puzzle, being like, what element is here? What can we learn about its properties? Can we find some of it? And so, yeah, a paradigm needs to both be like mechanical enough to be a mature science. It needs to have a proposal for entities and rules. And I think it needs to sort of provoke this puzzle solving.
So what would you want to see for your paradigm in the future? Are there sort of things you want to work on about it? Or are there ways you want people to use it?
Yeah, absolutely. And to sort of piggyback off the last answer, we think that there's like a really pretty obvious starter set of puzzle solving questions that people can work on and that we hope to work on. The most obvious one is, what's the list of drives? There's clearly more than one, right? There's a difference between eating and sleeping. We think we can make a pretty strong case that there's a bunch of different hunger drives. And we think that also, like, compared to other questions in psychology, compared to other ways of doing psychology, we think that these are fundamental questions. And by that we mean they're questions that as soon as you pose them, you can't get away from them. So similarly, like, is gold a compound or an element? That's a fundamental question about chemistry. Once you ask it, you have to know. And so asking, how many kinds of hunger are there? Is anger an emotion? Like, is it a negative feedback? Is it governed by a negative feedback loop, or is it something else? Is happiness governed by a negative feedback loop, or is it something else? Is happiness the same kind of thing as anger or different? These seem like they're fundamental questions, and they seem like they're questions that we can potentially answer, right? You can, at least for the hungers, you can sit down and you can come up, and we are coming up with a set of protocols where you can try to distinguish between different hungers. And so there is going to be at some point like a solved puzzle where we're like, we think there are however many kinds of different hunger, and here's what we think that they're controlling for. So yeah, those fundamental questions, and I'll pause so you can, anything else? I have other answers, but.
Yeah, I think immediate next steps are going to look a lot like rolling some balls down inclined planes type research using both human studies, and we are interested in doing some animal studies as well, and also modeling things on computers. I mean, I think ultimately the thing that gets me most excited about this paradigm is the idea that we could do things like cure depression and addiction and things like that.
Like you're saying that if your paradigm led to a much more precise definition of something like depression or addiction, then you could actually much more easily develop treatments for it potentially.
Yeah, exactly. And for something like, depression or insomnia, I think when you look at people's lived experiences of those conditions, it actually ends up looking like a bunch of different things, right? So symptoms of depression can be you sleep too much, but also you don't sleep enough, or you eat too much, but also you eat too little, depending on the person. And so we think that by having a better understanding of the fundamental human drives, we can kind of tease apart these different problems that people experience and help to solve them.
Yeah, to sort of zoom out, I think I would say there are two main directions that seem obvious to me. One is this sort of puzzle-solving phase. And the obvious puzzle-solving questions right now are, what are the list of drives? And what are the parameters of each of the drives and the motivational system? And then how do we measure these things? So if we want to know, like, what's Spencer's set point for his potassium drive, we'd love to be able to have a method of measuring that. So what's a list of drives? What are the methods needed to study that? What are the different parameters on those drives, and how do we measure them? So that's the sort of puzzle-solving side. The other side is, modeling, trying to use these ideas to build very, very specific models, build them out in software, kind of like you were saying, Adam suggested about The Sims, right? We can build a little model of how we think the mind works, and if, we disagree with Spencer about that, we can build two models, and then we can see, where do they disagree? Can we develop specific studies? Can we put people in a situation where the two models disagree? We can see what they do. And I think, eventually that will lead, and it's hard to know exactly the trajectory, but eventually that will lead to a better understanding of things like depression, anxiety, addiction, and maybe to better treatments.
Before we wrap up, final question for you. Why do you go by slime mold, time mold?
So the summer we started the blog, we were looking for a name, and we separately have been doing this bit where like somebody would see something and they would point it out, and then you'd like rhyme with it.
We were doing like Cockney rhyming stuff.
Yeah.
So like exactly. Like a raspberry, like that was a bad one. But like a raspberry, it's called raspberry because raspberry tart, and tart rhymes with fart. So we were doing a riff about slime molds. Yeah, and we got slime mold, time mold, and we liked it, and here we are today.
Yeah, one of us pointed out a slime mold on a walk through the woods, and the other one was like, oh yeah, slime mold, time mold. And then we were like, oh yeah, it's a good blog name.
That's an awesome origin story. Well, thank you both so much for coming on. We'll link to your work in the show notes. Generates a lot of fascinating ideas.
Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you so much, Spencer.
Thanks for joining us. We always love to hear from our audience, so if you have any questions or comments, send us an email at clearerthinkingpodcast@gmail.com. This episode was edited by Tone Support and transcribed by We Amplify. We would really appreciate it if you could rate and review us wherever you're listening to this, as it helps others find out about the show. And did you know you can now watch videos of the podcast? Just go to youtube.com/@clearerthinkingpodcast. Stay tuned in by subscribing to our email newsletter, One Helpful Idea. Each week, we'll send you one valuable idea that you can read about in just 30 seconds, along with that week's new podcast episode, an essay by Spencer, and announcements about upcoming events. To sign up for our newsletter, access transcripts, or learn more about our guests, visit podcast.clearerthinking.org. Josh asks, anxiety is generally viewed as a mental illness that needs to be treated. But of course, there are circumstances in which anxiety is probably a rational and appropriate response. Do you think the same is true of depression? In other words, when, if ever, is depression a rational and appropriate response to a set of circumstances?
This is a little bit speculative, but the way that I view depression at its most fundamental core is it's the view that you can't create the things of value, you can't get the things of value. So if you think about it from that perspective, imagine a situation where you go into a cave one day exploring, and then the entrance to the cave collapses. And so you're stuck in this cave, but there's nothing to do. There's nowhere left to explore in the cave. There's nothing to gather. You have enough food and water to survive, but there's literally nothing for you to do. Depression would be a very natural response because there's no way for you to produce anything of value while you're stuck in that cave. So what are you going to do? You're going to lie around. You're going to conserve energy. You're probably going to feel pretty hopeless. And these are the feelings of depression, right? Fatigue, lack of motivation, generally low movement, and a sense of hopelessness. And that actually makes sense in that situation because the only thing you can do is conserve energy. But as soon as there's something to be done, as soon as value can be created again, let's say there's a way to dig yourself out of the cave, well, now the ideal is no longer to be in the depressed state. So I do think there could be some situations where depression is the ideal response. That being said, I think most of the time when people feel depressed, there actually is stuff they can do to create value. It's just that they don't necessarily see a root there, or they have beliefs that are preventing them from creating that value. And so a lot of times I think they can be helped by seeing ways that they can do things that actually matter to them. And an example of this is behavioral activation, which is a set of techniques where it gets depressed people to start taking action in the world that are things that they usually find meaningful or valuable or pleasurable. And often that can help jumpstart people and get them out of depression.